this Thursday would be different.
Let us drink to the inevitable.
Even when he inhaled it, he was transported to this other place.
To the role of master and dog.
What is the fellow on about?
It was as if his mind had slipped a cog. And then I'd sit down, have a good scratch.
Went barking mad, you mean?
I doubt if one could be a dog and not have fleas.
Do you believe in reincarnation?
Poppycock.
I see he talked to you about it.
Don't tell me I don't believe in enough things already.
Well, firstly, congratulations on Dean Spanley. I enjoyed it immensely. And to be honest with you, it's not the experience I was expecting at all. I mean, it's a curiously emotional film that deals with, as far as I'm concerned, youth and innocence and inquisitiveness, but love and spontaneous adventure. But the idea of, if you drink a particular type of alcohol, an otherwise reclusive and inward man of the cloth will suddenly sprout reams of recollections about, well, being a dog in a past life. I mean, this isn't the usual script that would come across your desk. So what I want to know is tell me a little about when you received this, your attitude to it, and then the ultimate decision in accepting it, because I understand it wasn't immediate.
Yeah. Well, it is unlikely, isn't it? It's an unlikely premise, and it's a premise that's difficult to kind of sell to people, because you think, if I tell you too much, you're going to go, look, I don't think this is for me. And what the film does is it takes people by surprise. They're not quite sure what to make of it. And people stop me in the street and say, I don't know where this was going to go for half an hour, and then I suddenly realized I was on a sort of different journey than I had anticipated. But the second part of your question is, how did I respond to this? Well, I read this story. I was very puzzled by it. I was very touched by it. I was puzzled as to why they wanted me to play the Dean, and they kept coming back to me, and I said, I don't know how. Look, I really love this story. I find it funny and curiously moving, but I don't know how to play this character, and so I think I should do something else and go and look for somebody who knows how to play it. And they kept coming back. They were persistent, so I kept having to read it again. And then one night, I was in Africa. I woke up at 2 a.m. I thought, oh, I see what to do. And I had this kind of weird insight into, and I immediately looked for this, I found the script in my suitcase, started reading it again, and I started laughing out loud. My wife woke up and said, what the hell's wrong with you? And I said, I've worked out how to do it. Now I see. So, and I read the script with a whole lot more enjoyment, because I had this kind of way into it, an access.
Right. So did you have a lot of time to master this angle that you were going to take with the role, as in preparation? Because I'm imagining you on the vineyard, getting into character, having a few, and then being a dog. Did you do much of that? Because I imagine you'd have to, wouldn't you?
Well, no. In fact, this was the 5th of 5 films I'd done back to back. So I'd really had very little sort of preparation time, because I was just going from one character to another. And so it was really just that night, and then consolidating that thought the next day while I was at work on something else, that I knew where I'd be going. I wrapped that film, I went straight to England, and I had about 2 weeks before we started shooting. And there was no rehearsals. In fact, they started shooting before I got there, and I had to jump in. And I had lunch with the director, Tor Fraser. I told him what I intended to do, and I asked him if this was all appropriate. He endorsed it, and we went straight into it.
So the actors saw you doing that live, like on set, in a take. They hadn't seen any of this beforehand.
They were unprepared for all of this.
Brilliant. Well, that must add a lot too, because it really comes across that way, because as an audience member, you're watching this happen, it's like, what is this movie again? So if the characters are doing that semi for real, particularly people you know, like Brian Brown.
That's right.
What was the reaction after, cut on the first take of you doing something like that?
Look, the great thing about these other actors in this film, it is not only are they marvelous and magical performers in their own right, but half of the trick of, I don't know if it's a trick, but half of the thing about acting is actually not just speaking, but listening. And what I'm doing as much as anything is storytelling in this. And it is there, when you cut to them and they're listening, really listening to what you're doing, that's half my job. They've done half my job, and God bless them for that, God bless them. And they were immensely kind and generous to me, and I'd finished these enormous takes. And at one point I said to Peter O'Toole, look, I'm so sorry, Peter, but you've got days and days of listening to me doing this stuff. And he said, he paused, he took my hand, and he said, dear boy, I was enchanted. I thought, that's great. Thank you so much. Thank you, God, and thank you, Peter O'Toole. I'm going to be okay now.
Wow.
Peter said something else on that first day. He said, I said, we're doing something different here, aren't we, Peter? And he said, I tell you what, Sam, I read this script and I had no idea. I couldn't understand how they got the money for this. He said, it's too intelligent, it's too funny, and it's too original. How did they ever get the money to make this film?
Not many people might be aware, but there was a real fortuitous thing that happened to you with a phone call from James Mason. And long story short, James Mason called you and said, I like what you do, why don't you come over to England, here's a ticket. And then before you know it, you're the Antichrist in The Omen. Which, everything is a stepping stone to something else, and it's a personal favourite actually. I really like that film. Do you ever think what would happen if you didn't get that call? What type of career trajectory might you have had, or what? That's not every person gets that type of a break.
Yeah, well, it wasn't just a break. It was more like a sort of an endorsement, a very generous endorsement from someone who's obviously I grew up with James Mason's films, and I always particularly liked what he did. It was a great surprise to hear that very familiar voice. I was working in Melbourne. I was doing a thing called Lucinda Brayford. I was working on the ABC studios there, and in between setups, an assistant director came over and said, "There's a Mr. James Mason on the phone for you." And I said, "What?" And Mr. James Mason is calling from Switzerland. I thought it was a kind of a hoax of some kind, but I picked up the phone and it certainly sounded like James Mason. And he said, my wife Clarissa, and Clarissa was an Australian, he said, I'd like you to, I think you're good, and I think you should be working over here, and I'd like you to meet my agent, and I'm sending you a ticket. When can you get on a plane, come and stay with us, and then go on doing it? So I did that, and I stayed with them. I had a week in Switzerland, midwinter, and I got to know them. I was really quite. It was a really very surprising thing to happen.
Yeah. How old were you?
Oh well, I don't know. So I started very late in films, in acting in films. I was probably 30 then, but because I'd spent about 6-7 years in documentaries prior to that. But anyway, I spent this wonderful week with them. They lived near Lausanne, and we'd go cross-country skiing and stuff like that, and we'd talk about, I'd ask him stuff about, for advice, and he said, he gave me several bits of advice. He said, at this point he'd made 100 and something films, ridiculous. And what impressed me was, just like me to this day, was that every time he finished a film, he always, for his whole life, he never thought he would work again. Just like me. The second thing is never smoke in a film. Never smoke. They'll want you to smoke, but don't smoke in a film, because you start a scene at the beginning of the day, you light up, and then you've got 20 different angles, and you'll have to smoke a new cigarette for 10 takes for 20 different angles. That's, do the maths. That's 200 cigarettes in a day. It'll kill you. So I thought, well, that's good advice. The second thing he said was, I've got one acting tip for you. He said, always look at a door before you exit. And it's quite good advice. Now, if I'm going to leave that door, if I just get up and leave, it looks like I don't know what I'm doing. But if I look at the door and then get up, it's a...
Well, the information's coming through to me.
Yeah, you're thinking about what you're going to do. And if you think about what you're going to do before you do it, it looks like you meant to do it. It looks like it's not an accident.
Yeah.
So if you apply that to all kinds of things about screen acting, it's about as good advice as I've ever had.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Look, thank you. Thank you so much. Real pleasure chatting with you. Could have done it all day.
Thanks.
What happened? I cannot fully explain.
One moment you are running along, the next you are no more. Mustn't get too set in our ways.
Remarkable events often have ordinary beginnings. Never was this more true than of my talks with Dean Spanley.